I always loved camping. There was something about being out in the woods, away from people, from the city, from the stress of life. Just me, the trees, and the sound of nature. It was my way of unwinding. I had done solo trips before, nothing too dangerous. Just simple overnighters in national forests, places not too far off the beaten path, but secluded enough that I felt truly alone. I thought I knew what to expect. I thought I was prepared. I was wrong. It was late September, that perfect time of year when the air is crisp but not too cold. The bugs are mostly gone, and the leaves are just starting to turn. I had planned a one-night trip to a spot I had found on an old hiking forum. It wasn't an official campground, just a clearing deep in the woods off a service road, the kind of place where you had to park your car and hike in about 2 miles to get there. That was part of the appeal. No traffic, no other campers, just peace and quiet. I arrived at the trailhead around 4 p.m., a little later than I had hoped. The sun was already dipping low, shadows stretching long between the trees. I grabbed my pack, double-checked my gear, and set off down the narrow trail. It wasn't marked, just a faint path through the underbrush, but I had the route saved on my GPS. The hike in was uneventful, just the crunch of my boots on fallen leaves, the distant call of a crow, the occasional rustle of something small darting through the underbrush. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was just about to disappear behind the trees. It was a beautiful spot, a wide, flat area with soft grass, surrounded by towering pines. There was even a ring of stones where someone had made a fire pit long ago. I dropped my pack, stretched my sore shoulders, and got to work setting up camp. First, the tent. I chose a spot a little away from the fire pit, where the ground was soft but not damp. I staked it down, unrolled my sleeping bag, and set my flashlight and knife within arm's reach inside. Then I gathered some wood. There was plenty of dry kindling nearby, and I had brought a small hatchet to split larger pieces. Within half an hour, I had a decent fire going. As the flames crackled, I sat back on a fallen log and cooked a simple meal, just a can of chili heated over the fire. I ate slowly, enjoying the solitude, the way the trees seemed to swallow the sound, leaving only the fire's low popping and the distant hoot of an owl. Then I heard something, a single snap like a branch breaking, somewhere deep in the trees behind me. I froze, spoon halfway to my mouth, listening. Nothing. Probably just a deer, I told myself, or a raccoon. The woods are full of noises, especially at night. I forced myself to relax, finished my meal, and cleaned up, making sure to pack away my trash. By the time I crawled into my tent, the fire had burned down to glowing embers. I zipped up my sleeping bag, clicked off my flashlight, and closed my eyes. The forest was alive with sounds. The chirp of crickets, the distant yip of a coyote, the whisper of wind through the trees. It was peaceful. Then, in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. I lay still, heart pounding, trying to figure out what had pulled me from sleep. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching on the leaves just outside my tent. My breath caught in my throat. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear? Unlikely. It would make more noise snuffling around. A deer? Maybe, but deer don't move like that. These steps were careful. Human. I stayed as still as I could, barely breathing, listening. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Then, a faint rustling sound, right outside the tent. I gripped my knife, every muscle in my body tensed. The fabric of the tent moved slightly, as if something or someone had brushed against it. Then, nothing. Minutes passed. My ears strained for any sound, but the forest had gone completely still. No crickets, no wind, nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing, shallow and fast. I didn't dare move. After what felt like an eternity, I finally reached for my flashlight. Slowly, carefully, I clicked it on and aimed it at the tent wall.
No shadows.
No movement. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Maybe it was my imagination. Maybe a branch had fallen or an animal had passed by. Maybe, but I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I unzipped the tent, knife still in hand, and stepped outside. The forest looked normal, calm, but then I saw them. Footprints. Clear, fresh footprints in the dirt around my campsite. Not boot prints, bare feet, human. My stomach dropped. They circled my tent, then led back into the trees. I scanned the tree line, heart pounding. Nothing, just the quiet woods, the rising sun, the distant call of a bird. I didn't waste time. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, barely taking time to eat a granola bar. My hands were shaking as I doused the fire, shouldered my pack, and started back down the trail. Every few steps, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me. But there was nothing. I walked fast, nearly jogging at some points, not caring about the weight of my pack, not stopping to rest. The whole time, I felt it. That heavy, crawling sensation on the back of my neck. The feeling of being watched. When I finally reached my car, I threw my pack inside, jumped in, and locked the doors. Only then did I let myself breathe. My hands were still shaking as I turned the key, the engine roaring to life. I pulled out onto the service road, speeding faster than I should have, desperate to put distance between myself and that place. I haven't been camping alone since. I always loved camping. The quiet of the woods, the smell of pine, the way the night sky stretched forever without the glow of city lights. It was peaceful. At least it always had been. Last summer, I decided to camp alone. I had been out dozens of times with friends, but I wanted to test myself. See if I could handle a few nights in the woods with just my gear and my own company. No distractions, just me and nature. I picked a remote site, about 10 miles from the nearest road. It was deep in the forest, near a lake. I planned for 3 nights, just enough time to enjoy the solitude, but not so long that I'd get bored. I packed light, a tent, a sleeping bag, a small cooking setup, and enough food to last. I had my knife, my hatchet, and my flashlight. The essentials. The hike in was uneventful. The trail was well marked at first, but grew narrow and overgrown as I got deeper into the forest. Birds chirped, squirrels rustled in the brush. Felt good. I reached the lake by late afternoon and found the perfect spot. A clearing near the water, surrounded by trees but open enough for a decent view of the sky. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and started a small fire before the sun dipped below the horizon. The first night was uneventful. I sat by the fire, ate a simple meal, and listened to the sounds of the forest. The wind made the trees creak, and the occasional splash in the lake reminded me that I wasn't completely alone. Probably a fish, maybe a beaver. I went to bed early, feeling safe and comfortable. The next morning, I woke up to an eerie stillness. The birds were quiet. The air felt heavy. I shook it off, chalking it up to my imagination. I spent the day fishing, exploring the area, and enjoying the solitude. I found old tracks near the lake. Probably deer, maybe a bear, but they weren't fresh. Nothing to worry about. That night, things changed. I was sitting by the fire when I heard something. A snap, deep in the woods. I froze, listening. Another snap. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Too heavy for an animal. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the trees, but the beam caught nothing but darkness. Probably just settling branches, I told myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I didn't sleep well. Every noise made me jolt awake. The wind howled through the trees, but underneath it, I swore I could hear something else, something moving. The third day, I felt uneasy. I thought about leaving early, but I convinced myself I was being paranoid. I had come out here to prove something to myself, and I wasn't going to let my imagination ruin it. I spent the day gathering more firewood, making sure I had enough to keep a fire burning all night. I set up a perimeter of small branches around my campsite. If anything moved through them, I'd hear it break. It was a trick my grandfather had taught me. As the sun set, I felt exposed, vulnerable. I kept the fire big, the light pushing back against the shadows. But the woods beyond my camp were black. I sat with my back to the lake, so nothing could approach from behind. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, closer this time, crunching leaves, slow, deliberate, not an animal. I held my breath, gripping my knife. I waited. The fire crackled. The night stretched on, but nothing happened. I didn't sleep. I kept the fire going, listening. The footsteps had stopped, but I felt watched, hunted. I thought about grabbing my gear and hiking out in the dark, but the idea of walking through those woods, blind except for my flashlight, made my skin crawl. I waited for dawn. When the first light broke through the trees, I packed my gear in record time. I didn't even eat. I just wanted out. The whole hike back, I felt that pressure, the sense of something just out of sight, watching. The moment I reached my truck, I threw my gear in and locked the doors. My hands were shaking. I didn't feel safe until I was miles away. I still don't know what was out there. Maybe nothing. Maybe someone. But I know one thing. I'll never camp alone again. I don't know why I agreed to go on that trip. Maybe it was the way the guys made it sound. Just a weekend in the woods, nothing crazy. Just some fishing, grilling, and cold beers by the fire. I guess I wanted the break, the quiet, but I didn't know how wrong I was. We chose a spot way out past the last little town, someplace one of the guys had heard about from a coworker. It wasn't on the usual maps, just a patch of green surrounded by miles of nothing. We followed dirt roads for what felt like forever, then parked where the trees thickened and hiked in with our gear. No cell service, no people, just us and the wild. The first night was normal. We set up camp near a clearing by a narrow creek. The trees around us were tall and dense, old. You could hear the wind moving through them, making deep groaning sounds like something alive. We joked about it, played it off, but there was something heavy in the air. I tried to shake it off. The next day was uneventful. We fished for a while, caught a few small ones, and sat around drinking and laughing. It was good, felt normal. But that night, it started with the sound. A low, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled through the underbrush. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer moving awkwardly through the trees. But it was too steady, too deliberate. Stopped, then started again, closer. I listened, frozen, staring out at the trees. The fire had burned down low, just glowing embers, so the shadows stretched long and deep. My breath felt too loud. The others were still talking, not paying attention. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just the wind shifting branches. But then something changed. A smell rolled in, thick and rancid, like something rotting, like meat left out in the sun for too long. It made my stomach turn. The others smelled it too. I could see it on their faces when they finally noticed. One of the guys stood up, shining his flashlight out into the trees. The beam cut through the dark, landing on nothing but trunks and leaves. Then the sound started again, but faster, closer. I gripped my knife, not sure what I was expecting to do with it. My heart pounded. We stood there, barely breathing, waiting, but nothing came. Nothing showed itself. Eventually, the smell faded. The dragging sound stopped. We sat back down, laughing it off, but it wasn't real laughter. No one said it, but we all felt the same thing. That sick, creeping feeling in your gut when you know something isn't right. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined something standing just outside the firelight, watching. The next day, we thought about leaving. Someone brought it up, real casual-like, but we all knew why. No one wanted to admit we were scared. Instead, we made excuses, said we'd go later in the day after we packed up. We tried to act normal, went out hiking for a bit, but there was this weight over everything. Even the woods felt different. The birds were quiet. The wind barely moved. Then we found the deer, or what was left of it. It was torn apart like something had just ripped into it. The rib cage was cracked open, the inside's gone. No blood, though, just clean, white bones and pieces of fur. The smell hit us before we even saw it. I heard one of the guys whisper, "That ain't right." We turned back fast, heading for camp. None of us said it, but we were done. The trip was over. When we got back, something felt off. At first, I couldn't place it. Then I saw my tent. It was unzipped, wide open. My sleeping bag was dragged halfway out, like someone had been searching through it. The others checked their stuff too. Backpacks unzipped, gear shifted around. That was it. We packed up in silence, fast as we could. The whole time, I felt eyes on me, the weight of something unseen pressing down. I didn't look back. None of us did. The hike back felt longer, the woods too still. We kept hearing things. Branches breaking, rustling just beyond sight. We moved faster. Then, when we were almost back to the trucks, we found the footprints.
Bare.
Human, deep in the dirt, and too large to be any of ours. No one spoke. We just got in our trucks and drove. I haven't been back to the woods since, and I don't think I ever will. I never wanted to go on that trip. I should have trusted my gut. But my brother, Mark, had been talking about it for months, and I didn't want to back out at the last second. It was a remote spot up in the mountains, a few hours outside of town. No cell service, no other campers, just us, a tent, and the woods. Mark had found it on some forum about hidden gems for hiking and camping. He liked that kind of thing, always searching for the most secluded places, the ones no one else had touched. We packed light, just the basics: tent, sleeping bags, enough food and water for a few days, a hatchet, and a hunting knife. Mark insisted we didn't need a gun, even though I argued for one. I hated that idea, being that far from help without real protection. But Mark said it was unnecessary. "It's just a weekend in the woods, man," he said before we left. "We'll be fine." The first few hours of hiking were normal. The trail was rough, barely a trail at all, just a suggestion of one. We had to push through thick brush, step over fallen trees, and keep checking the GPS to make sure we were on track. Eventually, we found the clearing where we planned to set up camp. It was a small, flat spot surrounded by trees, with a stream about 50 yards downhill. It was peaceful, quiet, too quiet. I ignored the unease in my stomach and helped Mark set up the tent. As we worked, I noticed something weird. The ground was packed down in places, like someone else had camped here recently. But there were no fire remains, no trash, nothing left behind. Just an impression in the dirt that didn't quite look natural. That night, the feeling got worse. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the tent ceiling, listening. There was no wind, no rustling of leaves, no distant sounds of animals moving in the brush, just complete silence. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I must have drifted off at some point because I woke up to a sound, a single footstep outside the tent. I held my breath, waiting for Mark to react, but he was snoring. Another step, slow, deliberate. I told myself it was an animal, but I knew better. I reached for my flashlight and hesitated. If I turned it on, whoever was out there would know I was awake. If I didn't, I'd just be lying there, waiting. The steps stopped. Then came a sound I didn't expect. A low, steady breathing, just outside the tent wall. I finally switched on the light and sat up, heart pounding. "Mark," I whispered, shaking his shoulder. He groaned, rolling over, half asleep. I listened. Nothing. Whoever or whatever it was had stopped breathing. I waited, listening for another 10 minutes, then 20. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been my imagination and lay back down. Morning came and I almost believed it had been a bad dream. Almost. Until I stepped outside and saw the footprints. They circled our tent. Bare footprints, human.
No shoes, no boots.
Just the shape of a person's feet, pressed into the dirt. Some were right up against the fabric, like someone had been crouching, listening, watching. I woke Mark up immediately. He was groggy, annoyed, didn't take it seriously at first. But when he saw the footprints, he went quiet. He just stood there, staring at them. I could tell he was trying to come up with a reasonable explanation, but there wasn't one. "We're leaving," I said. "Now." Mark hesitated. He wasn't scared yet, just uncomfortable. "It's probably just some other camper messing with us," he said, but his voice wasn't as sure as usual. "Let's just stay one more night." I wanted to punch him. "Are you kidding?" Someone walked around our tent while we were sleeping, barefoot. "You want to stick around and see what happens next?" He ran a hand through his hair, thinking, "Let's at least eat first. Then we'll go." I didn't like it, but I agreed. We cooked a quick breakfast over the small camp stove, ate in silence. I kept looking at the trees, half expecting to see someone watching. But there was nothing. Then Mark pointed at something. A tree about 10 feet away. There were marks on the bark, deep scratches. Not from an animal. They were long, vertical cuts, like someone had dragged a knife down the trunk. Fresh too, maybe a day old at most. "All right," Mark muttered, finally getting serious. "Let's pack up." We threw everything into our bags, moving fast. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like we were being watched. The whole time, I had that same sick feeling in my gut, the one I had before we even left home. I wished I'd listened to it. The hike back was worse. We hadn't noticed on the way in, but now that we were looking, we saw more signs. Broken branches, disturbed undergrowth, other trees with those same long knife marks, like someone had been marking a path, leading somewhere, leading to us. We didn't talk much. We just kept moving, faster than before. It was about halfway back when we found it. A shirt, dirty, crumpled, lying in the middle of the trail. It had dried blood on it. Neither of us said anything. Mark just stepped around it and kept going. I followed. The car was still there when we got back, just as we'd left it. We threw our gear into the trunk and got inside. Mark turned the key. Nothing. He tried again. Still nothing. The battery wasn't dead, we had power, the radio worked. It just wouldn't start. Mark swore under his breath, checking his phone. No service. I tried mine. Same thing. "Pop the hood," I said, getting out. My hands were shaking. I told myself it was just a mechanical problem, just bad luck. But when I looked inside, I knew better. The engine was fine. The wires were fine. But the battery cables, they had been cut. I turned to Mark, feeling sick. "We need to walk." Neither of us hesitated anymore. We grabbed what little we could carry and started down the dirt road. We had no idea how far we'd have to go before we found help. The whole time, I kept looking over my shoulder. The road was empty, but I knew someone was out there, watching. We walked for hours before we finally found another car. A couple of hikers heading home. They gave us a ride back to town. We never told them what happened. A few days later, Mark went back with a tow truck to get the car. It was still there, but the tent, our gear, everything we left behind, Gone. The wind howled through the trees as I pulled my jacket tighter around me. I had been hiking all day, pushing myself to get as deep into the wilderness as possible before dark. I wanted solitude, a chance to clear my head from the stress of life, work, and everything else weighing me down. The forest was thick, untouched, the kind of place where you could walk for miles and not see another person. That's what I wanted. By the time I set up my tent, the sun had dipped below the tree line, casting long shadows through the underbrush. I gathered some wood and got a fire going. The flames flickered against the trees, making the darkness beyond them seem even blacker. The sounds of the forest, branches creaking, leaves rustling, distant owls, filled the night air. I took a deep breath, feeling a sense of peace settle over me. It was just me and nature, exactly how I wanted it. After eating a quick meal, I sat by the fire, staring into the embers. My mind wandered, but something felt off. It was subtle at first. The way the wind shifted, the way the trees seemed to lean in just a little too close. I shook it off as exhaustion, but then I heard it, a snap, a twig breaking somewhere in the darkness. I sat up straight, my eyes scanning the tree line. The fire crackled beside me, but beyond it, the forest was pitch black. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer, maybe a raccoon, but my gut twisted. Something about the sound had been deliberate, like a footstep. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but twisted branches and thick undergrowth. My heart was pounding. I wasn't sure why, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Minutes passed. I forced myself to relax, to brush off the paranoia. But just as I was about to turn back to the fire, I heard another sound. Closer this time. Breathing. Not heavy, not loud. Just the softest inhale and exhale. Right beyond the glow of the fire. I froze. My blood ran cold. The firelight flickered, playing tricks on my eyes, making shadows shift and stretch. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was being paranoid. But then I saw it, a shape, a dark figure, crouched low between the trees, just past the firelight. I didn't move. My body screamed for me to run, but I was frozen in place. My mind raced. Who the hell was out here? I hadn't passed a single person on my hike. There were no trails nearby. And why were they just watching me? Seconds stretched into eternity. I forced myself to breathe as slowly as possible, trying not to make a sound. My flashlight was still in my hand. I swallowed hard and flicked it on, pointing it straight at the figure. Nothing. The beam illuminated empty trees. Nothing but rough bark and tangled branches. But I knew what I saw. I knew something had been there. My gut was screaming at me. I turned off the flashlight and sat back down by the fire, my back stiff, my ears straining to hear anything else. The wind had died down. The usual night noises had stopped. Silence. I told myself I was overreacting, that the long hike, the isolation, the darkness had all played tricks on my mind, that I was just seeing things. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my tent, eyes wide open, listening. Every rustle of leaves, every shift in the wind, sent my heart racing. But nothing else happened. By the time dawn broke, I was exhausted. The forest looked different in the light of day, less menacing, more peaceful. I almost laughed at myself. Almost. I packed up my gear quickly, ready to leave. As I was rolling up my sleeping bag, I noticed something. Footprints. Not mine. They circled my campsite. Close. Too close. My stomach dropped. My hands went cold. Someone had been there, standing just outside the firelight, watching me. I grabbed my gear and left as fast as I could, hiking back the way I came, barely stopping to catch my breath. Every now and then, I glanced over my shoulder, feeling that same gnawing sensation of being followed. But I never saw anything. By the time I reached my car, I was drenched in sweat, my legs burning from the hike. I threw my gear in the back, locked the doors, and started the engine. Relief flooded me as I pulled onto the dirt road, leaving the forest behind. I didn't go camping alone again after that, because some things out there don't want to be seen, but they're watching you anyway. It started like any other weekend trip. I packed up my truck early Friday morning, throwing in the usual camping gear: tent, sleeping bag, cooler, extra clothes. I had planned to spend 2 nights alone in the woods, just to get away from everything. Work had been a mess, and I needed the space. I picked a spot in a national forest, not one of those busy campgrounds where you hear people laughing and playing music all night. This was a place where you had to drive down a long dirt road, miles from anything, and find your own spot. No bathrooms, no picnic tables, just wilderness. That's how I liked it. The drive took a little over 2 hours. I passed a couple of trailheads and pull-offs, but I kept going until I found a small clearing by a narrow stream. It was perfect. Flat ground, plenty of trees for shade, and no sign of other campers. I parked, got out, and took a deep breath. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. No sounds except the wind moving through the trees and the water trickling nearby. I set up my tent near the truck, laid out my sleeping bag, and stacked some firewood I had picked up on the way. The afternoon passed easily. I fished a little but didn't catch much. Mostly, I just sat by the water, enjoying the silence. As the sun dipped lower, I got a fire going and cooked some food. The flames flickered, casting long shadows over the trees. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the crackling fire and the distant hoot of an owl. It felt good to be away from everything. Then, as I was finishing my meal, I heard something, a rustling in the trees behind me. I turned my head, but it stopped. Probably just an animal. Deer were common in these parts, maybe a raccoon or a possum. I didn't think much of it until later that night. I had put out the fire and crawled into my tent. The night was cool, and the sound of the stream was enough to lull me to sleep. Then, in the middle of the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. I just had this feeling, like something had changed. I listened, trying to figure out what had pulled me out of sleep. The forest was quiet, too quiet. The usual sounds, the insects, the occasional rustle of the wind were gone. Then I heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, not an animal, something walking on 2 feet. I held my breath, listening. It was close, moving around my campsite. Slow steps, a pause, then another step. I reached for my flashlight, heart pounding. I didn't turn it on yet. I just held it, waiting. Then, the footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I could hear breathing, not loud, just steady, close. I stayed frozen, my mind racing. I had a knife in my bag, but it was zipped up. My truck was only a few feet away, but my keys were in my boots outside the tent. I felt trapped. Then, after what felt like forever, the breathing moved away. The steps faded into the woods. I didn't move for a long time. Eventually, I worked up the nerve to unzip the tent a tiny bit and shine my flashlight outside. The fire pit, the chair, everything looked the same. My boots were still there. No sign of anything. I waited. Nothing. I must have sat there for an hour, flashlight in hand, barely breathing. Eventually, exhaustion won and I dozed off. The next morning, I stepped out of the tent, trying to shake off the unease. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe I had dreamed it. Then I saw the footprints. Not mine. Bigger. Heavier. They circled my tent, then led off into the trees. I packed up within minutes. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just threw everything into my truck and got the hell out of there. As I drove back down the dirt road, I kept looking in the rearview mirror. I didn't see anything. No people, no cars, just trees. I haven't been camping since. I never used to be scared of the woods. I grew up hiking, camping, and spending weekends in state parks. The forest was peaceful to me. It was a place where I could escape from work, from responsibilities, from the noise of the world. But that trip changed everything. I don't go camping anymore. I don't go anywhere near the woods if I can help it. It was late October when I decided to take a solo camping trip. I had done it before plenty of times, and I liked the solitude. The fall air was crisp but not too cold. The leaves were at their peak colors, and the crowds were gone. I picked a spot deep in Hoosier National Forest, far from the more popular campsites. I wanted to be alone. The drive out was quiet. A few small towns passed by, then just winding roads through endless trees. I found an old logging road that led deeper into the forest and parked my truck off to the side. I packed light, just the essentials, enough food for a couple of days, and my tent. I hiked about 3 miles in before I found a good spot. It was a small clearing, flat and dry, with just enough space for my tent and a fire pit. Setting up camp was routine. Tent up, firewood gathered, food stored properly. I sat by the fire as the sun went down, eating a simple meal, enjoying the silence. It felt good to be disconnected from everything. No phone service, no emails, just the sound of the wind moving through the trees. The first night was uneventful. I slept well, woke up early, and spent the day hiking. I followed a deer trail for a while, spotting tracks and droppings, but never saw any actual deer. I found an old rusted-out truck deep in the woods, probably abandoned decades ago. The metal was eaten through with rust, the tires long gone, the windows shattered. I always found things like that interesting, evidence that someone had once been here just as I was now. I took a couple of pictures, then moved on. That evening, I got back to camp just before dark. I built another fire, cooked some food, and sat watching the flames. It was colder that night, and the wind had picked up. I could hear it moving through the trees, making the branches creak and groan. I was tired from hiking all day, so I crawled into my sleeping bag early. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. I wasn't sure why at first. Then I heard it. A sound in the distance, something moving through the woods. It wasn't the wind. It was footsteps, slow and deliberate. At first, I thought maybe it was a deer, but the steps were too heavy. A bear, maybe, but black bears in Indiana aren't common. I listened, heart pounding, barely breathing. The steps moved closer. They weren't fast, but they weren't hesitant either. Whoever or whatever it was, they weren't trying to be quiet. I reached for my flashlight, clicking it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees. I scanned back and forth but saw nothing. The footsteps stopped. I listened for what felt like forever, but the woods were silent. Just the wind and the crackling of my dying fire. I told myself it was nothing. My mind playing tricks on me. Maybe a raccoon or a coyote. Still, I kept my flashlight in my hand as I lay back down, listening until I eventually drifted off to sleep. The next morning, I checked around my campsite. There were no tracks, no signs that anything had been there. I felt a little stupid for getting so worked up, but the feeling of unease stuck with me. I debated packing up and heading home, but I had planned to stay another night, and I didn't want to leave just because I had spooked myself. I spent most of the day exploring again, keeping my mind occupied, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was just this nagging sense in the back of my head, like I was being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees, but I never saw anything. By the time I got back to camp, I had convinced myself I was just being paranoid. The woods were playing tricks on me. I forced myself to relax, made another fire, and cooked dinner. Then, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, I heard it again. Footsteps, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight, heart hammering in my chest. I turned it on, pointing it toward the trees, but saw nothing. "Hello," I called out. My voice sounded small, weak. The footsteps stopped. The woods went silent again. I stood there, listening, my breath coming in short bursts. Then, just beyond the firelight, I saw something move, a shadow just at the edge of the trees. It was tall, standing still, watching. I gripped my knife, my mind racing. Was it a person? A hunter? Some lunatic living out in the woods? I took a step back toward my truck, but then it was gone. Just gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire with my flashlight in one hand and my knife in the other, listening. The footsteps never came back, but I knew it was still out there, watching, waiting. As soon as the sun started to rise, I packed my gear and left. I hiked back to my truck as fast as I could, constantly looking over my shoulder. I felt exposed, vulnerable. The whole time, I expected to hear those footsteps again, but the forest was silent. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back and got inside, locking the doors. I sat there for a moment, catching my breath. Then I noticed something. In the dirt, just outside my driver's side door, were footprints. Not mine, bigger than mine, leading from the woods to my truck, and then back again. I left so fast I almost tore up the road getting out of there. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the highway, surrounded by civilization. I don't know who or what was out there with me. I don't want to know. All I know is that I'll never go camping alone again.